Tyler Nash never expected the land he inherited to become a battleground. It had always been a quiet stretch of Oregon backcountry. Several acres of mixed forest and old prairie rolled out around the barn his grandfather built by hand in the 1950s. The barn was sturdy, unpainted, and bore the weight of decades like a veteran wears his scars, without apology. For Tyler, the place wasn't about nostalgia. He wasn't sentimental. What mattered to him was use, purpose, independence. After years spent in the saturated chaos of city life, where neighbors listened to your arguments through paper-thin walls and every square inch of property was contested by bylaws and street sweepers, this land was sanctuary. Not because it was quiet, but because it was his. He'd spent the last 4 years restoring the barn and converting part of it into a fully equipped restoration workshop. Tyler wasn't a collector or an exhibitionist. He didn't post photos of half-finished cars online or enter competitions. His work was private, rebuilding classic engines, welding fractured frames, and preserving the geometry of vehicles from a more honest era. It grounded him. Most days he worked alone, with an old radio playing news talk or blues, and the constant rhythm of tools moving against metal. He wasn't antisocial, just uninterested in small talk. He spoke only when necessary, and when he did, it was direct. The locals called him a bit standoffish, but never rude. In a region where property meant pride and survival, Tyler blended in well enough. The barn stood a good 100 yards back from the main road, connected by a winding gravel drive that passed through an archway of black pines. To the north, an old fence separated his land from a more recently developed housing tract. Identical homes with manicured hedges, imported stone facades, and plastic mailboxes that looked like they'd never seen rain. Tyler had watched those homes rise one by one with a growing sense of unease. At first, the development seemed benign. A handful of lots, couples with dogs, then kids, then more houses. But soon came the signs. Community regulations, a self-appointed neighborhood council, and long email threads about what constituted visual uniformity. Tyler's land, however, was exempt. His property was a legacy parcel, privately held under a deed that predated the zoning changes by nearly 70 years. He'd confirmed that detail twice before finalizing the title transfer. So when letters started arriving from the neighborhood board, requests for voluntary participation in regional initiatives, recommendations for curb appeal improvements, and eventually notices implying that his barn was non-compliant with emerging safety standards, he shredded them without reading past the first paragraph. It wasn't arrogance. He simply knew his rights. But the visits were harder to ignore. At first, it was polite. A man in a polo shirt with a clipboard, asking if Tyler had considered painting the barn to better match the neighborhood aesthetic. Then a woman from the so-called beautification subcommittee left a small ceramic planter on the front porch with a passive-aggressive note. He never responded. Then came Karen Fielding. She introduced herself not by name, but with a tone. A practiced smile, that blend of politeness and domination that only came from years of social positioning and groupthink. Karen stood at the edge of his driveway one afternoon, arms crossed, sunglasses perched on her head, and said without preamble, "You know this entire area is part of a cooperative security initiative now." Tyler didn't engage. He simply looked past her, nodded once without warmth, and turned back toward the barn. From that day, something shifted. The lights were the first thing he noticed. Tiny shifts in routine. Things moved out of place. One evening, coming back from the supply store with new fasteners and electrical cable, Tyler noticed the barn's main light had been switched off at the breaker, even though he always left it on low for security. He blamed himself. Later that week, he found one of his spare lockboxes open, the contents untouched but the latch unfastened. Still, he assumed it was absent-mindedness or maybe animals. Then came the night he saw the taillights. It was past midnight. A dry wind had kicked up across the property, whistling through the pines and raking dust across the gravel. Tyler was up late working on a carburetor when he heard it. A low rumble, subtle but deliberate, not the random whine of wind or the scurrying of animals, but tires on stone. He moved to the side window in silence. Sure enough, there was a vehicle, black mid-size SUV, emerging from the barn at a slow, careful angle. It didn't rush. No lights, no panic. The driver maneuvered like they had every right to be there. Tyler stepped outside just in time to see the vehicle reach the curve in his driveway, where it disappeared down the road and into the trees. He didn't give chase. He didn't call the police. Instead, he walked to the barn, his boots crunching slowly in the gravel, and checked the door. Locked. Or at least it appeared to be. But when he turned the key, the lock slipped easily, with no resistance. It had been replaced. Same model, same brand, but a different cylinder. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. Nothing seemed out of place. His tools were intact. No signs of forced entry. But something felt off. A faint smell of engine oil hung in the air. Newer, synthetic, not from anything he'd worked on recently. Tire marks, faint and carefully positioned, were visible in the dust near the back wall. He followed them to the side ramp where they ended in a clean arc and faded. That's when he noticed the electrical panel, partially unscrewed. 3 of the 4 mounting screws had been loosened. Someone had accessed the power supply, not as vandalism, as access. That night, he didn't sleep. By morning, he had changed the locks again, this time choosing a model with a custom key pattern and a tamper-proof housing. He disconnected external power to the barn and installed an independent generator with a kill switch inside his house. Then he mounted a camera, not a cheap cloud-synced webcam, but a trail cam designed for wilderness hunters with long battery life and motion sensitivity. He concealed it in the upper corner of the barn, facing the entrance, then placed 2 more along the gravel drive. He knew this wasn't just a prank, it wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't a teenager sneaking in for a joyride. Whoever entered that barn did so with tools, with keys, with the knowledge of the layout. They had parked inside, worked or waited, then left with the same composure. That required planning, authority, permission, or at least the illusion of it. And Tyler had a sinking suspicion that it was connected to the same smiling face that stood at his driveway weeks ago. He wanted to believe this was a one-off, that maybe someone had mistaken his barn for an emergency shelter or used it as a waypoint on some rural detour. But deep down, he already knew that wasn't true. People didn't just wander into a locked building and replace locks with precision unless they expected no consequences. Tyler had read stories, articles buried beneath local politics, dry legal battles, and property disputes gone quiet. He knew how land could be manipulated, how private property could be redefined with enough committee votes and bureaucratic jargon. The letters he'd thrown away now echoed in his mind with a different weight. He didn't want conflict. But he'd defend what was his. And as he stood in the doorway of his barn, looking at the fresh tire tracks and the subtle scuff marks on the floor, he realized something more chilling. This wasn't an accident. Someone had chosen his property not as a target, but as a tool. And they were counting on his silence. They were about to be disappointed. 3 days passed before anything overtly suspicious happened again, but the silence was not comforting. Tyler had begun to notice small changes, incremental signs that someone or several people were still operating with deliberate subtlety around his property. The wind chimes he'd installed years ago on the edge of the barn's overhang were no longer moving freely. The wires had been twisted ever so slightly, as if brushed by someone attempting to move quietly beneath them. His trail cam footage showed nothing unusual during those 3 days, just the flickering of tree shadows and the occasional raccoon. Yet, every time Tyler walked into the barn, he could feel the presence of something out of sync with the space he knew intimately, like a book on a shelf being a quarter inch out of place. A hammer moved 2 inches. A rag folded differently. Items left as they were, but unmistakably touched. On the 4th morning, as a low fog crept along the grass, he found a large envelope wedged between the door and frame of his front porch. There was no postage, no return address. Just his name, Tyler Nash, printed in neat, centered block letters. He picked it up carefully, took it inside, and opened it at the kitchen table. Inside were 4 documents, printed, not photocopied, and a brief typed letter on plain white paper. The letterhead bore the insignia of a property management company Tyler had never heard of, followed by the header, Notice of Participatory Adjustment. The letter claimed that under a newly adopted regional ordinance, his barn was being designated as a conditional community storage asset. It was written in sterile, bureaucratic language, clearly designed to obscure more than inform, but the core message was undeniable. A legal maneuver was in motion to assign shared access rights to his structure, without his consent. The included document cited an obscure local zoning policy amendment passed last year. Tyler read through the clauses, highlighting key phrases as he went. Parcel transition buffer zone. Temporary reassignment for community need. Silent acceptance in absence of formal objection. Nowhere did it say he had signed anything. Nowhere was there proof of agreement. But the wording was designed so that inaction, failing to object within a certain window, could be interpreted as acquiescence. Tyler felt his stomach tighten. He had never received anything about this until now, and that window had already passed. He reread the first page 3 times. The language was unmistakably careful, teetering between suggestion and threat. Though no outright demand was made, the implication was clear. You've already agreed, whether you realize it or not. That same morning, he drove into the county recorder's office. It was located in the basement of a municipal building that hadn't been remodeled since the early 1980s, with cracked linoleum floors and a flickering fluorescent panel above the front counter. The clerk was polite but indifferent, and after Tyler handed her the parcel number, she disappeared into a back room. When she returned, she had a thin file folder in hand and a look of unease in her expression. Inside the folder were copies of the original deed to the land, along with 3 recent notations attached to the parcel's administrative log. One referencing a community asset application, another labeled Infrastructure Usage Variance, and the last marked simply as executed. Tyler asked her who had filed the applications. The names listed were unfamiliar, but one jumped out, Karen Fielding. He pressed for clarification, asking whether she had any authority to act on his behalf or any documentation granting her rights over his property. The clerk shrugged and replied that the system recognized her as Community Liaison Coordinator, and under that title she had submitted adjustments through the Expedited Approval Portal. Tyler, trying to keep his voice level, asked how that was possible without his signature. The answer chilled him. According to the document trail, consent is assumed under the advisory provision of Provisional Code 412B, she said, not bothering to disguise the fact that she didn't fully understand what any of it meant. You'd have to file a reversal petition if you believe there was an error. That'll take a few weeks, though. Weeks. It wasn't an error. It was coordinated. He drove home without turning on the radio, fingers tight around the steering wheel. The procedural creep he was witnessing wasn't just a paperwork trick. It was a tactic, a methodical effort to create the illusion of legitimacy where none existed. And it was being done through layers of automated, pre-approved infrastructure no one in the public was equipped to challenge without a lawyer and several months of lost time. This wasn't a dispute about zoning or neighborhood preferences. This was a covert appropriation of private space, executed under the false flag of administrative language, using legal silence as a crowbar. When Tyler pulled into his driveway that evening, he noticed something new. The gate that blocked vehicle access to his barn, A heavy-duty sliding barrier he had installed himself had been rolled open, not broken, not damaged, just casually pushed aside as if it no longer belonged to him. A faint trail of tire tracks cut through the gravel path and disappeared around the bend behind the barn. He didn't rush. He walked slowly, calmly, checking his periphery, listening for movement. When he rounded the corner, the barn doors were open, only slightly, a few inches, but enough to suggest someone had either entered or exited recently. His camera system had recorded nothing, which meant one of two things. Either they'd jammed the signal, or they'd bypassed it physically. He entered the barn with deliberate care, turning on the overhead lights. Nothing appeared stolen or broken, but his toolbox had been moved. One of the wrenches was left lying perpendicular to the others. Again, not random. It was the second time in a week that something had been subtly altered. Not enough to scream sabotage, but enough to make his skin crawl. On the far workbench, he spotted something that didn't belong. A clipboard with a carbon copy delivery slip attached. It was a real form used by freight companies to confirm drop-offs, but the information had been sloppily filled out. No company name, just initials. PRAF. No date, only the words Cycle 3. Under Receiver, the name listed was Karen Fielding. There was no doubt anymore. This wasn't a simple overreach or a miscommunication. Someone was using his barn as a drop site, moving vehicles or equipment under the radar, and legitimizing it through backdated administrative paperwork. The camera system had been effectively neutralized, the power grid accessed and manipulated, and now the paper trail was being fabricated to match a false narrative. What disturbed Tyler most wasn't the scale of the operation, but the certainty with which it was carried out. Whoever was behind this wasn't worried about being caught. They believed they had already won. That night, he called an old contact, a legal analyst he'd worked with years ago while helping a friend fight an eminent domain case. The man's name was Deacon Reese, and though he specialized in land use law, he had a reputation for sniffing out fraud buried under layers of city planning bureaucracy. Tyler didn't explain everything. He simply said he needed to understand the process by which community boards could repurpose private property without a signature. Deacon asked a few pointed questions, then paused. If they're citing 412B, they're using cooperative jurisdiction assumptions, Deacon said. It's legal on paper, but only if they notify you. If you never received notice and they didn't get an explicit waiver or signature from you, it's voidable. But here's the problem. Those kinds of errors don't stop them from continuing. You have to actively challenge it. The longer you wait, the more it becomes precedent. What if I never received the notice at all? They'll say they posted it publicly or sent it digitally through a registered newsletter. That's how they play. You'd need to prove they didn't, which is tough. How often do you see this? Deacon was quiet for a moment, then answered flatly, "More than I should." By the end of the call, Tyler knew one thing. He was out of time to be passive. What had started as strange footsteps in a quiet barn had escalated into a calculated methodical usurpation of his property, facilitated by legal gray zones and front-facing smiles. Someone had the resources, the nerve, and the arrogance to believe that he wouldn't fight back, that he'd fall into the same trap most people did: confusion, delay, defeat by exhaustion. They were betting on his silence. They were wrong. He wasn't going to wait for another envelope or another unsigned document pretending to be law. The next time someone stepped into his barn uninvited, he'd be ready, not with confrontation, but with evidence. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about strategy, and he was about to start playing by a different set of rules. The first time Tyler spotted the white SUV again, it was parked on the ridge above his southern tree line, right where the gravel shoulder dropped off and met the old fence post boundary of his land. It was too far to read the license plate, but the outline was the same. Smooth, wide-set frame, smoked windows, those same reflective headlight panels he'd caught in his trail cam's static blur 3 nights earlier. He didn't make a move toward it. He stood just inside the barn's side entrance, watching from behind the partially drawn shade, letting the sunlight play off the vehicle's windshield like a mirror. The SUV didn't move for a full 10 minutes. Then, without flashing its lights or making any engine noise audible from where Tyler stood, it rolled backward down the ridge and disappeared behind the tree line as casually as if it had never been there at all. It wasn't the first time he'd felt watched since the notices arrived, but it was the first time someone had made the surveillance that obvious. They weren't just observing. They were telegraphing their presence, establishing dominance without ever setting foot on his porch. That subtle flex, that performance of ownership, stoked something in Tyler beyond anger. It was a deliberate reminder. We can come this close and you can't stop us. He didn't take the bait. He simply wrote down the time, the weather conditions, the position of the sun, and the estimated distance from the barn to the ridge. Documentation was his new weapon. He had no illusions that the system would protect him, but he'd be damned if he gave them nothing to use when the time came. The very next morning, the gate at the back of the property, the one that connected to the disused fire road, was open. Tyler never used it. The hinges were rusted into near immobility, and the padlock had been the same since his father bolted it there decades ago. Yet it hung open like a half-latched mouth, the lock missing entirely. Not cut, not broken, just gone. No note, no footprints, but the weeds near the trailhead were crushed in a pattern that didn't match animal traffic. Someone had brought something through there, likely large, likely heavy, and they'd done it without triggering any motion alerts. That same afternoon, he found deep tire ruts near the rear shed, freshly impressed into the soft earth after a light rain the night before. They curved, veered sharply, then stopped abruptly just short of the barn's rear door. It looked like a three-point turn, tight, practiced. The only problem was, Tyler hadn't moved any vehicles that night, and the make of those treads didn't match anything in his garage. Inside the barn, things had shifted further. His acetylene tank had been relocated from the far left wall to the center platform, a move that made no sense mechanically, but might have made access easier for someone unfamiliar with the layout. A set of jack stands had been laid out in a triangle, unused but aligned with precise spacing, and behind a tarpaulin near the back wall, Tyler found the most unsettling discovery yet. A box of license plates. 23 in total. All out of state. None of them matched any vehicle currently stored on the property. Some were bent, others wrapped in plastic, but a few had been polished clean, stacked in sequential order like someone had just finished inventory. Tyler stared at them for several minutes, his hands still gloved from the morning's weld work, the sweat drying quickly under the chill of realization. Whoever was using his barn wasn't hiding anymore. They were staging. He didn't call the sheriff. He didn't contact the community board. He did something much smarter. He drove to the town over, 42 miles northwest, where a friend of a former colleague owned a security hardware shop. There, he purchased 2 hardwired pinhole cameras, a signal-blocked DVR unit, and 4 thermal tags designed for cold storage warehouses. That night, under full darkness and without using his own headlights, he installed the cameras inside the barn rafters and wired them into a battery-banked loop recorder hidden inside an empty toolbox. The thermal tags he affixed to the structural base of the barn's interior, behind wall panels, beneath shelving units, and one beneath the floor where he'd once installed a drain system. They would track changes in sustained temperature over time, an essential indicator if engines were being run in secret or cargo was being moved during late hours. The next 2 nights passed in silence. The cameras recorded nothing, or at least nothing beyond bats and shifting shadows. But on the 3rd night, the footage showed a brief flash at 3:17 a.m., a single beam of light, a phone or flashlight sweeping quickly across the floor, then gone. No clear subject, no sound, just 1 second of artificial light crossing the lens. When Tyler played it back in slowed speed, he caught the faint silhouette of a figure moving in front of the far window, and then nothing. But the thermal tag beneath the drain showed an anomaly. A 5-degree rise in temperature sustained for 18 minutes, followed by an abrupt drop. Something had been there, hidden, possibly idling. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone was operating under the assumption that the barn was now theirs to access. Not daily, not regularly, but predictably. Every few nights at odd intervals with shifting equipment and what now looked like mechanical cycles. Vehicles were being brought in, used, possibly modified, then moved again. And if they were using the rear road and fake utility access as cover, that meant coordination. Tyler began to review county maintenance records. The fire road had officially been listed as access pending repair since 2017. There had been no official traffic permitted on it in over 6 years. But 2 weeks ago, a new entry had been filed. Emergency clearance approved for seasonal remediation. Vehicle access permitted under Property Infrastructure Aid Committee authority. Tyler had never heard of that committee, and when he checked the name attached to the authorization, he wasn't surprised. Karen Fielding. She hadn't spoken to him since the strange envelope arrived. No email, no visit, not even a passive-aggressive flower pot. She was silent, but her handprints were everywhere. The last nail in the coffin came when Tyler received a letter marked Non-Compliance Escalation Notice. It was hand-delivered, unsealed, placed inside his mailbox without postage. Inside, the letter accused him of obstructing essential community logistics and listed a pending fine of $11,450. There was no itemized detail, no proof, no signature, just a date and a barcode. Tyler scanned the code using his secure tablet. The link redirected him to a login portal for a transportation logistics management system, one he recognized as being used by freight networks for large-scale commercial carriers. When he clicked View Shipment Records, it opened a page marked Transfer Manifest, Interim Storage Facility B. Underneath were 6 entries. All had his barn's coordinates listed as the delivery location. All were marked as processed. The escalation was no longer just bureaucratic, it was criminal. Someone was actively laundering vehicles or assets through his property using a shell logistics platform and creating digital trails to imply legitimacy. He didn't know what was in those shipments. He didn't need to. What mattered was that his land was being used as a staging area for something that had no business being there, and someone had gone to considerable lengths to make it appear that he was either complicit or negligent. At 2:30 a.m. that same night, Tyler was awakened by the dull hum of tires crunching gravel. He slid out of bed, barefoot, silent, and moved to the upper loft window. A white van, unmarked, no lights, was pulling out of his barn's east entrance. It stopped for exactly 4 seconds, paused at the turn, then continued down the side path toward the fire road. He didn't go after it. Instead, he walked down to the barn with a hammer, unbolted the back panel, and checked the thermal tag beneath the floor. It was still warm. This wasn't just escalation. It was entrenchment. And someone was about to find out what it meant to dig themselves in too deep on the wrong man's land. Tyler had always prided himself on his ability to stay measured, especially in situations where most men would lose their grip or get reckless. But as the pattern of intrusion deepened into a structure, and the weight of evidence turned from suspicion into certainty, he knew the next decision couldn't be just defensive. It had to change the tempo of the game entirely. For 2 weeks he'd played quiet, documented, tracked, and secured, but the pace of the incursions had accelerated. The white van, the manifest trail, and the digital breadcrumb left deliberately on that barcode-laced notice were all moves made by people who believed themselves untouchable. If he waited for another incident, they'd escalate again, and the line between victim and accessory would blur further. He'd already crossed from invaded to implicated. That realization hit hard, and not because he feared legal consequence. He feared misrepresentation, the manipulation of systems designed not to protect the truth but to reinforce paperwork. He made the next move not by confronting the board, not by confronting Karen, but by exploiting their arrogance. Tyler reached out to a state-level transportation inspector, a real one, under the pretense of verifying property access along the abandoned fire road, citing concern about unregulated vehicle use and damage to bordering private lots. It was a calculated move, non-accusatory, low-profile, and, most importantly, based in a legitimate public safety concern. The inspector, a plain-spoken man named Rosales, responded with interest. Tyler didn't overshare. He simply explained that undocumented traffic had been noted and that he was worried about liability if someone were to be injured on a road technically listed as unmaintained. 2 days later, Rosales appeared on the property unannounced but cordial. He wore no badge, no aggressive posture, just an ID lanyard and a digital slate for recording reports. He confirmed immediately that the fire road should not be in use, especially not for repeat commercial traffic. Tyler offered no claims, made no mention of the barn, simply accompanied Rosales as he walked the tree line, taking photos and making notes. When they reached the back gate, now chained by Tyler with a reinforced plate, Rosales raised an eyebrow. "Was this your modification?" Tyler nodded. "Good call," Rosales said. "Looks like someone was running something through here. Not legal." He took a long look at the slope behind the gate, then added, "I'll need to cross-check this with recent road activity. If anyone filed for temporary use clearance, it'll show up in the next update cycle." That was all Tyler needed. The visit left a digital footprint, an official presence, a time-stamped report, and a reason for the State Transportation Office to begin reviewing movement patterns in that corridor. It was the first crack in the false narrative, the first verifiable indicator that something unauthorized was being moved on and off his land. And, more importantly, it was initiated without accusations, without finger-pointing. It was infrastructure-based accountability, not paranoia. 3 nights later, the temperature sensors lit up again. This time, not one, but all 5. The tags recorded sustained thermal spikes for over an hour, longer than anything prior. That same night, one of Tyler's hidden cameras captured the image of a man inside the barn, heavily built, wearing a full mask and gloves, but unmistakably methodical. He moved to the east wall, reached behind the breaker panel, and appeared to toggle something before crouching down and pulling a heavy black duffel out from under the rear shelf. Then the feed cut. A clean kill, not a glitch. The line had been severed, manually. Tyler found the wire the next morning, sliced with a compact rotary cutter, the blade still hot when he touched it. Whoever was operating inside now knew about the surveillance. They weren't just trespassing. They were countering. The escalation wasn't just physical, it was administrative. Tyler received an overnight package the next morning, signature required. The envelope came from a courier service based in a neighboring county, and the contents were more formal than anything prior. A cease and desist notice from a shell company calling itself Regional Storage Holdings, LLC. The letter accused him of unlawful interference with logistical coordination and warned of legal repercussions for obstruction. The document was laced with intentionally vague phrasing, but beneath the legalese was a message loud and clear: stop interfering or face a lawsuit. But the letter made a crucial mistake. It listed the supposed contractual coordinates of the barn. Those coordinates were 6 digits off from Tyler's property. Not a simple typo, but a digital ghost. A deliberate error placed to make the operation seem clean while redirecting liability elsewhere. Tyler knew what this meant. The operation was sophisticated but sloppy in its ambition. It had grown too fast, too confident, and now it had left behind traces that could be weaponized. He packaged the letter, the video capture, and copies of the thermal tag data into a sealed envelope and shipped them to Deacon Reese, the legal analyst he'd spoken to weeks before. This time, he included a note. "They know I know. They're escalating. Let's talk." The response came within 12 hours, not by call, but by arrival. Deacon showed up himself, in person, pulling into Tyler's driveway in a nondescript sedan. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "This isn't just a property fraud ring," he said, stepping inside the barn with slow, measured steps. "This is high-volume logistics laundering. They're moving items, vehicles, probably assets tied to salvage or theft, through secondary sites using manipulated administrative overlays. And your barn, it's one of the blind spots. Not on any real-time traffic grid, no toll monitors, no active surveillance overlays. Perfect." Tyler didn't flinch. "So, what do we do?" Deacon crouched beside the breaker panel, examined the slice in the wire casing, and tapped it twice with a pen. "We make them repeat the mistake. We let them do it again. But this time, we record everything through federal eyes. I've got someone who can initiate a passive oversight trigger. Quietly, they won't know it's happening." He stood. "But we need one more cycle, one more entry." Tyler nodded, slowly. He understood the risk. But more than that, he understood the value of making the truth undeniable. At that point, it wasn't just about preserving his property. It was about cutting the cord they thought they could wrap around his neck and yanking it until someone on the other end couldn't breathe. That night, he did nothing. No new locks, no new sensors, just silence. Waiting. The war had stopped being one of territory. It had become a war of evidence. And soon, they'd leave him all he needed. Tyler didn't sleep the night after Deacon's visit. He remained on the edge of wakefulness, body still, mind constantly measuring risk. The barn, so long his fortress, his retreat, had become a corridor of movement, of ghost-like presence, of shadowed intentions and engineered exploitation. He had always known people could manipulate laws, twist paperwork into weapons. But what chilled him now was the layered boldness of what had rooted itself into his land. This wasn't local corruption. It wasn't a group of petty opportunists stealing space. This was precision. This was a system functioning under a veneer of legality, powered by logistics and data, cloaked behind untraceable subsidiaries and third-party shell companies, all feeding into a larger enterprise whose size he was only beginning to grasp. The next night, it happened. At 1:42 a.m., the east field sensors went live, one by one, in a cascading pattern that suggested movement not of a single person, but a convoy. Tyler didn't go out to meet them. He sat silently in his living room, lights off, the quiet hum of the DVR backup system in his chest like a second heartbeat. Through the tiny digital feed, he watched. First, 2 black pickup trucks rolled in, headlights off, engines idling low. Then, a white transport van, this time clearly marked as part of a fictitious landscaping company. Decals clean and printed, but the font too generic, the placement too centered. Behind it came something larger, a flatbed tow truck, empty. It reversed up to the barn's main entrance with the kind of speed that comes from repetition. They moved in teams. 3 men exited the vehicles, all in plain clothing, none bothering to mask their faces this time. One handled the barn lock, Tyler's newest deadbolt without force, using a tubular key tool that slipped in and turned the mechanism in under 3 seconds. They weren't breaking in. They were entering something they believed they had rights to. As they opened the doors, the barn lights flickered once, then steadied. Tyler's generator had been tripped. He felt it, the shift in current, the dead hum of the back line. Someone had located the external cutoff and bypassed it. Inside, the men moved with the focus of operators, not laborers. One went directly to the back wall, pulled a stack of tarps aside, and revealed a black SUV, one that hadn't been there the day before. It was hidden so effectively beneath constructed debris that even Tyler had missed it. The other 2 opened the van and retrieved 2 metal cases, long, reinforced with triple locks. Not tools, not car parts, cargo. They opened the rear of the SUV, transferred the cases, then closed everything with choreographed ease. It was clinical, practiced. This wasn't the first such exchange, only the latest. Tyler noted the time, captured every second of the feed, and sat motionless as the men finished loading the flatbed with what appeared to be a hollow frame of a second vehicle. A shell with no engine, no plates, just the carcass of what once was a vehicle. They strapped it down like pros, exited the barn, and departed in reverse order. Flatbed first, then van, then pickups. No words, no noise, just out. Once they were gone, Tyler exited his house slowly, walked to the barn in near total darkness, and examined the door. They hadn't relocked it. Inside, the generator was humming, but not his. A secondary power source wired into a converted fuse box near the ceiling had been activated. It had been hidden behind insulation. Professional installation. Whoever had built the override system had done so weeks ago, possibly longer. As he powered it down, Tyler felt a calm, surgical sort of anger. Not hot, not shaking, just precise. The house had been opened, the walls breached. The enemy had walked in, walked out, and left fingerprints as if it didn't matter. They believed he was already conquered. Deacon's contact at the bureau had watched the feed in silence. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask to meet in person. But the call came less than 6 hours later. Her voice was clipped, neutral, but edged with attention. "That site is compromised," she said. "They're using it as a soft asset node. It's being rotated into the shell company's transit network. Your local governing board is either complicit or being used as blind cover." Tyler didn't ask for clarification. He understood. They were laundering through physical space, scrubbing stolen assets by moving them through unregulated waypoints that appeared legitimate on paper. His barn had become part of that sequence, a node in a false chain of ownership, tied to manipulated manifests and cooperative jurisdiction cover. Every movement through his property wasn't just physical. It was a signature of false authenticity in a greater web. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Nothing, for now," the agent replied. "Let them finish their next cycle. Then we act. But be aware. If they know you're watching, you may become a target for containment. You've been quiet. Stay that way." Containment. The word hit harder than expected. Tyler didn't ask what it entailed. He didn't need to. If they believed he was a liability, there were ways to erase that. He'd seen it before: reputational destruction, legal strangulation, even personal sabotage. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't careless either. That same morning, he took out an insurance policy. Not just on the land, but on the narrative. He printed hard copies of every manifest, every camera timestamp, every shipping log, and placed them in 4 sealed envelopes. One went to Deacon. Another to a safety deposit box in a bank 40 miles south. The third he gave to a local journalist he barely knew, under the pretense of a background property story. The fourth he kept inside a welded safe hidden beneath the old tool shed floor. The next week passed like a drumbeat. Every day, new activity, but quieter now. Less confident. He saw fewer vehicles, fewer open moves. But the tracking software Deacon had linked him to showed new entries being filed under false companies, all connected to a cluster of addresses surrounding his own. A larger web was being spun, and his barn wasn't the center, only a part of the weave. Then came the letter. It wasn't hand-delivered. It came through legal channels. Official. Certified. Inside was a formal property reassessment request, filed through a jurisdictional authority Tyler had never interacted with, an agency responsible for emergency logistics compliance. The letter claimed that, due to a regional shortage of commercial zoning space, his barn had been flagged for conditional conversion review. In short, they were trying to reclassify his land as a temporary logistics hub, retroactively legalizing what they'd already been doing. That was the move. That was the shift. They weren't hiding anymore. They were institutionalizing the crime. Tyler forwarded the documents to the agent. Her reply was brief. "This confirms intention. Stand by." He didn't have to wait long. The next night, movement returned. 2 vehicles, one of which had previously been used in a different part of the network. They weren't just transporting now. They were crossing threads, using nodes interchangeably. That was enough. That was the mistake. At 4 to 12 a.m., as the van pulled into the barn and 2 men exited with containers, Tyler heard it. The distant hum of rotor blades. Not loud, not military, but sharp, deliberate, helicopters, low-flying, closer than they should be. 5 minutes later, the lights hit. Floodlamps from 3 separate angles, blinding arcs of white slamming into the property from mounted sources placed days earlier by the Bureau under the cover of power work. Then came the voices, sharp, commanding, unflinching. Orders barked in sequence. Engines killed, hands raised, movement halted. From his position on the porch, Tyler watched as federal agents in black gear poured onto the land, surrounding the barn, securing exits, disabling vehicles, zip-tying operators without hesitation. They moved fast. They moved clean. No confusion. No friendly fire. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stood, arms crossed, watching it unfold like a theater act written months before, but only now reaching its performance. When it ended, there were 7 detainees. One of them, to no surprise, was Karen Fielding. She had arrived earlier that night in her car, parked down the road near the fire trail access, walking in under the pretense of property monitoring. She was cuffed like the others. No screams. No resistance. Just that familiar, over-practiced expression of disbelief, like someone still clinging to the idea that authority could save her, that her title made her immune. The lead agent approached Tyler an hour later, once the perimeter was secure. "You did the right thing," she said. "You were methodical. You gave us more than just suspicion. You gave us pattern, structure. That's rare." Tyler didn't nod, didn't smile. He just looked out toward the barn where federal techs were stripping wires, cataloging false panels, marking areas for forensic sweep. "Will they come back?" he asked. The agent shook her head. "This cell's burned. They'll redirect. But this spot, this one's closed." And just like that, the node collapsed. But Tyler knew better than to relax. He understood networks. You didn't kill them by severing one limb. You slowed them, made them adapt. Somewhere else, other barns were being opened, other names, other lies, but not here, not anymore. The days following the takedown moved with a surreal slowness. Tyler's land, once the center of an invisible storm, now stood in a hush that felt both earned and unnatural. Federal vehicles still lingered along the outer perimeter, mostly unmarked, their presence a silent warning to anyone foolish enough to think this story had ended with zip ties and floodlights. The barn was sealed off temporarily, its doors tagged with federal property notices, and technicians in disposable suits swept through its interior for 3 days, documenting every wire, every modified outlet, every smuggled signal relay embedded behind the walls. What had once been Tyler's personal sanctum had turned into a crime scene, a warehouse of evidence, a case built not from blood or bullets but from silence, manipulation, and logistical deceit. And yet, for all the chaos, there was no catharsis, no satisfaction. The system had moved, yes. But Tyler knew the machine they'd wounded wasn't destroyed. It had simply blinked. The hardest part came when they dismantled the override systems. Each removed cable, each dug-up transceiver revealed just how thoroughly the operation had rooted itself into his property. They had installed a second layer of infrastructure beneath his own, hidden in plain sight. Routing boxes camouflaged to look like vintage electrical units, backup power supplies buried behind false walls, even a secondary circuit that had been masked. As an old irrigation line, every discovery drove home a singular, infuriating truth. They had built themselves into his world, assuming they would never need to explain themselves. It wasn't just infiltration, it was colonization. When Karen Fielding appeared for her first hearing, the courtroom was only half full. No press, no spectacle, just a procedural bench conference to establish preliminary charges and bail. Tyler didn't attend. He didn't need to see her play the role of community leader caught in a misunderstanding. But he read the transcript afterward, noting every word with a kind of grim curiosity. Her defense was standard. Denial of knowledge, insistence that she had been misled by third-party vendors, vague references to temporary oversight roles, and delegated authority. It was textbook plausible deniability, the kind that usually worked, when paper trails were thin. The problem was, this time, there was paper. Lots of it. Federal agents had pulled a massive cache of internal emails from the dummy logistics portal Karen had managed through her neighborhood access privileges. Emails that detailed payment schedules, vehicle manifests, and detailed coordination with third-party subcontractors, all of which connected to a larger network of regional asset recovery zones. Tyler's barn had been just one node in a string of illegal vehicle laundering operations, and Karen hadn't just known, she'd been facilitating it. Worse still, she'd done it under the umbrella of a voluntary community leadership role, using homeowners' trust as cover while quietly rerouting access rights, zoning waivers, and digital registration loopholes. What made Tyler sick wasn't the crime, it was the confidence. The knowledge that she and others like her had manipulated systems so subtly, so surgically, that even government agencies had missed it for years. It took a private citizen's unwillingness to be ignored to trigger action. But Tyler hadn't done it for justice or even principle. He'd done it because his home had been violated, because something sacred, his independence, had been treated as collateral in someone else's operation. That sense of theft couldn't be undone by arrests or press releases. It lingered. On the third day of deconstruction, a federal tech named Alvy, a soft-spoken man in his 40s who carried himself like someone used to bad stories, handed Tyler a drive. "Here's the copy of everything that passed through the DVR," he said, "in case you ever want to know how deep it went." Tyler didn't respond. He placed the drive on a shelf in the house, unopened. The idea of revisiting those images felt pointless. He'd lived them already. But what changed everything was what came next. 3 weeks after the raid, Tyler received a letter from a federal claims division. Not law enforcement, but from a civilian oversight group that handled reparations in cases of federal asset seizure. Inside was a formal offer, a stipend to cover involuntary property use, a tax credit for temporary disruption, and a direct question. Would Tyler be willing to testify under oath regarding the extent of infiltration and the mechanics of the unauthorized logistical footprint? It wasn't coercive. The language was respectful, but the intent was clear. They weren't finished. They were going after the network, and they needed him. He took 2 days to consider, not because he feared retribution, he had already become a witness by default, but because he knew the cost of involvement. Once you stepped into that ring, you weren't just a landowner anymore. You became a case, a reference. A face tied to a federal operation that inevitably would end up in some report, some briefing. But then he remembered what it felt like to walk into his own barn and know he was no longer its only inhabitant. He remembered the sound of tires on gravel when no one had been invited. He remembered the false smile on Karen's face that first day, pretending to explain a cooperative security initiative like it was a bake sale. He signed the letter, returned it by courier. 2 weeks later, he was flown to a secure site to give a closed-door deposition. It was clinical, professional, but thorough. He answered every question with precision, every timeline, every sensor alert, every instance of unauthorized entry. He didn't embellish. He didn't speculate. He simply gave the truth, clean and unadorned. The agents listening didn't interrupt. They didn't nod. They simply took it all in, building something larger with each piece. It wasn't until he was back home that the true weight of what had happened began to sink in. The barn was empty now. The smell of old oil and rust still hung in the air, but the machines were gone, replaced by silence and fresh dust. Tyler began to repair the walls himself, one plank at a time, not to erase the past, but to reclaim it. It was slow work, but deliberate. No shortcuts, no hired help. Every screw, every board, every layer of insulation reinstalled by his own hand. But just as he began to feel normalcy returning, another letter arrived. This one wasn't from the government. It was from a private real estate holding company based out of Arizona, claiming that they were pursuing interest in the surrounding parcels, an unsolicited, pre-buyout assessment. The letter asked if Tyler would consider selling, hinting that, with recent adjustments to community structure, your location may no longer offer the quiet independence it once did. It was polite, it was professional, and it made his blood boil. Because beneath the corporate phrasing, the message was clear. The network wasn't dead. It was adapting, morphing, retreating from visibility and preparing for the next move, the next land, the next weak link in the chain. It wasn't just Karen. It wasn't just the 7 arrested. This was systemic, built into the bones of property law, jurisdictional ambiguity, and the modern obsession with packaging land as a scalable asset. Tyler didn't respond to the letter. He burned it in the fire pit out back. He stood in the night, the flames curling into the air, watching the paper turn black, then orange, then gray. He'd been used. His land had been used. But they'd made one mistake. They chose the wrong man. And now, he wasn't just rebuilding his barn. He was making sure no one like them would ever do it again. Because once you learn how the structure works, once you see where the levers are, you stop waiting for permission to pull them. And Tyler Nash had no intention of asking ever again. Winter settled in late that year, but when it came heavy. The trees lining Tyler's property dropped their leaves in tight spirals, blanketing the forest floor in a soundless layer of damp decay. The wind that moved through the barn's newly sealed boards carried no echo now, only the quiet groan of honest aging wood. With the barn restored, the power rewired under his own control, and every access point rebuilt from the frame out, Tyler could finally stand in the center of the space and feel like it belonged to him again. No hidden cameras. No ghost locks. No unauthorized circuits masked behind drywall. Just tools. Just silence. Just peace. But peace wasn't the same as closure. The federal investigation was still active, still expanding. Periodically, Tyler received updates, not directly, but through Deacon, whose legal consulting had become more involved than either of them expected. Tyler hadn't asked to be a permanent point of contact, but his cooperation had become a cornerstone. His case, the video footage, the paperwork, the hidden wiring systems, they'd become the model the Bureau used to detect similar sites across other rural corridors. 4 barns, 2 garages, 1 repurposed feed distribution center. All of them had been tagged with the same hallmarks: rapid infrastructure, partial legitimization through layered digital filings, and selective cooperation from local entities too naive or too complicit to ask the right questions. Karen Fielding, along with 2 other regional coordinators, had taken plea deals in exchange for their cooperation. But others had vanished. No shows in court, dissolved LLCs, phone numbers disconnected. The network had always relied on plausible distance, on vapor. And despite the arrests and the exposed framework, the deeper core of the system had slipped back into the dark. It had never needed permanence to function, only silence. And so Tyler stayed vigilant, not paranoid, not obsessed, just prepared. The trail cams were still active, but now paired with under-the-surface seismic sensors of his own design. Nothing fancy, just enough to tell when a vehicle crossed a specific pressure threshold. He wasn't afraid of another incursion. He was simply unwilling to be blind again. The town, too, had shifted. The local board had dissolved under pressure, replaced by a temporary administrative review group brought in by the state to oversee pending appeals and zoning audits. Tyler didn't attend any meetings. He received the summaries via mail but rarely opened them. He knew that whatever came next, new regulations, community outreach programs, revitalization plans, would be cosmetic. Systems didn't fix themselves through memos, but he also noticed the difference. Neighbors who once offered only side glances now made small acknowledgments. A nod at the store, a pause in traffic to let him turn first. Not gratitude, not friendship. Just a subtle shift in perception. Recognition. They knew what had happened even if they didn't fully understand it. They knew he hadn't folded, that he'd stood quietly against something they hadn't seen until it was too late. He hadn't burned anything down. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd just held the line until someone else finally noticed it was worth protecting. And in that quiet acknowledgement, there was something close to resolution. On the first night of snowfall, Tyler walked the length of his property with a flashlight in one hand and a thermos of black coffee in the other. The sky was heavy with low clouds, the kind that made sound feel distant. The air pressed flat. He passed the old fence line, the gate to the fire road now welded shut and braced with a steel beam. No one would be coming through there again. He circled back to the barn, opened the main doors, and stood beneath the rafters, listening. The air was still. Not sterile, not dead, just clean, honest. In the weeks to come, he would resume his restoration work, one car at a time, the way he always had, not to forget what happened but to reclaim the purpose they tried to hijack. The barn had never been a storage facility. It had never been a pass-through. It was a space for building, not laundering, for creation, not concealment. And now, finally, it could return to what it was meant to be. Tyler didn't consider himself